Okay, so it is setting up to go live now. So we will be live on YouTube momentarily, and we will also be on Facebook. Okay, so it is setting up to go live now.
Good evening, everyone. It's really good to see you again, even if it's just virtually. Well, we have another important and packed meeting tonight, and we're going to pick up where we really left off in the last meeting, diving into the work you have done in groups to start to get to the heart of some of the very important questions like, what is a transformational mobility network? What do we want it to achieve for our community? And finally, what do each of the components of the network comprise? Then we're going to start to dig into funding options for the network. And this is obviously very critical because, as we have discussed from the very beginning, creating a bold, game-changing network is going to cost something. With the remainder of the time, we are going to talk about our current state of mobility and get to hear from you in an interactive way with some live polling to get feedback on some key questions. And we want to see how your answers compare to the polling we've done in the communities. Finally, we're going to wrap up with some time to react to public comment and questions before we talk briefly about what's coming up at the next meeting. But before we get started, I wanted to thank all of you once again for your engagement between meetings. I'll bet you didn't sign up for the homework we were going to give you, but I have been absolutely pleased by the enthusiasm at which you went at this task. And I look forward tonight to another robust discussion. And I want to stress that we want to hear from everyone on the call. So I may call on some of you. You've all been appointed to this task force for a reason. And I want to make sure that we hear from everybody and hear all of your ideas, comments, and questions. Before we get started again, I want to have Taiwo remind us of where we started and where we're going. Taiwo.
Thank you very much, Mayor Gan. Good evening again, everyone. So good to see all of you virtually. This slide is really more of a reminder slide in terms of what we're charged with. We definitely do have an end goal here, and that is we are expected to deliver something to Mayor and Council and the community at the end of December of this year. If you remember in the invitation letter that went to all of you back in February, inviting you to be part of this task force, there were a couple of things that were highlighted in that letter. One of them was to talk about multimodality, not just about rail or bus, but also greenways, paired bike. It's really very people-focused mobility. And then also that at the end of the day, we deliver what we call a transformational mobility initiative or program to the Mayor and Council at the end of the day. That could be the basis of a potential 2021 voter decision. And so this is more of a reminder thing that this group is meeting, but while this group is meeting, with their specific goals to engage the community, to review plans, to look at and assess funding needs as well as mobility needs, we are also, staff continues to present this initiative to different groups. So you see on there, the Charlotte Regional Transportation Planning Organization, we've presented to them. We're gonna present to them again in this month. And then actually in October, we're gonna present to the Metropolitan Transit Commission next week. We've presented to the Mecklenburg delegation. We've presented to the Intergovernmental Relations that has joint council and county commission members. We've also presented this on September 2nd, I believe, to the County Board of Commissioners. So staff continues to make those concurrent presentations and receiving feedbacks from all these policymakers and elected officials. We continue to also meet with Alliance, the Business Alliance, with regards to the infrastructure series, while we are also meeting with a group, Metro Mobility Coalition, that's been put together by Sustain Charlotte. And I believe some of you have spoken with Sustain Charlotte already. So again, I will remind you of this every time we have these meetings. So if anyone is asking questions, we can be consistent with how we're responding. And very important that we continue to see this platform as an opportunity for civic engagement. That's it. Thank you, Mayor.
All right, Scott, do you want to proceed with the homework assignment?
Yes, thank you, Mayor. And like last month, I'd like to start by saying thank you to the task force members for your thoughts and collaboration on this. We've been very impressed with this group and your dedication to the work, and also with your intelligence around transportation planning issues. We won't be able to fully capture everything that you told to us in this quick overview. So we'll count on you all to chime in as we go through these slides, and I'll pause a couple of times to give you an opportunity to do that. We also hope that you'll see that the issues your groups were wrestling with in the homework are reflected in the State of Mobility report that Stephen will introduce later. So we've done our best to summarize what we heard from you, and just like last month, we've also included some specific quotes from each of your group's responses. So let's dig in. Next slide. The first question we posed was, how would you define transformational? And we found that different groups came at this from a lot of different directions. Some folks talked about creating different types of transportation choices and establishing dedicated facilities for those different modes of transportation. Some groups focused on safety and moving from a car-centric city to a more multimodal and equitable city. I think it was interesting that multimodality and equity is something that came through in nearly every group's comments. Several groups focused on the lived experiences of our residents and the experiences of our visitors as they move through the city. Access to opportunity was also another theme. And then one thing that I thought was particularly interesting was there was sort of a tension between some groups talking about encouraging us to be innovative and original versus following best practices from other cities. And I don't think that was intended to be mutually exclusive, but it could be a good source of conversation later on if we choose to dig into that. I was also struck that a couple of different groups used the term disruptive as a way to describe transformational, and it was used in a positive sense, as in disrupt patterns of inequity, to disrupt car-centric thinking, and to disrupt stereotypes around who takes transit. Next slide. So this is a quote from Carl, Ken, Tammy, and William, talking about what transformational meant to them: broad connectivity and access to reliable transportation for all residents across Charlotte. They were one of the groups that pointed to using best practices from other growth cities. Next slide. This from Chris, Eric, Janet, and Pedro, and I think this comment was grounded in some history around how transportation has been used in our past, and a desire to shift that thinking and alter the way that we invest in transportation in the future. Next slide. The second question that we posed to you all, actually, I'm sorry, Mayor Gant, let me pause there and see if there's any reactions to some of that content from the first question.
That summary of the first item. I was interested in the comment, particularly the second one, that talked about our transportation system of the past needs to shift away from shifted away from the original intent, and that highways that stripped apart neighborhoods, and segregated neighborhoods became a theme. And that came from Chris, Eric, Janet, and Pedro. Does anybody want to elaborate on that a little bit more, or do you think it speaks for itself? Anybody in that group?
Mayor, I would defer to, I mean, Pedro contributed heavily in that particular comment. So if he feels he wants to speak a little further on it, I invite him to do so.
I didn't hear the full question. It was partially muted, Your Honor, so I didn't hear the first part of the question.
Pedro, I thought it was just an interesting insight that you talked about how our highway system, our road system, really was used to achieve social goals. I'm sorry. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can now.
How our system of mobility in the past was used to achieve certain social goals. One of them being, from my perspective, a real negative, and that is the segregation of communities and setting them apart. Did you want to
Absolutely.
elaborate on that a little bit more?
Sure. The history of urban development and highway development comes straight out of the 1930s. LaGuardia hired Robert Moses to help design highways in New York. And his objective was to create Levittown and other suburban communities and to ensure that the focus was on the vehicle, not on the people. He disrupted New York City, tore through sections of the city that were primarily minority. And that model had been followed to almost to every other city around the country. And so when we look at urban construction and the use of highways, they were designed to keep particular neighborhoods, red line neighborhoods, under-resourced neighborhoods out of the way, and to allow access to suburban communities which created white flight and all of the other issues. And so as we look at what we're trying to do, I wanted to be sure that we had not forgotten that structural racism and disenfranchisement that pre-exists our attempts to try and create a global, welcoming, and equitable city.
Thanks, Pedro.
You're welcome.
Some of us on this task force can say that we have seen that actually happen here in Charlotte, as I'm sure many of you have. All right. Is there anybody else that wants to make a comment on that before we go on?
Mayor, it's Eric. I just would like to add to Pedro's comment that, that system also asks our residents to, that barrier to own a vehicle, that cost up front is part of the divide. And you think back to the 250,000 residents who don't drive, what we're saying to them today, bringing it forward to today, is if you want to be mobile, you have the bar for achieving that is to be able to afford that car. So it's a barrier there as well. So I just, that mindset, of what we're developing and what we're asking subconsciously almost of what our residents need to have in order to be successful. And I think that the next transportation system needs to not require residents, create an artificial barrier for success.
Thank you, Eric. Yeah, that's an interesting point that we designed a road system designed for mobility. And in fact, what we did was reduce the activity sphere and access to the city for a huge number of citizens. It's a good point. Let's go to item 2.
So the second question that we asked y'all to dig into, what outcomes and community benefits would you expect to see 20 years from now as a result of the Transformational Mobility Network? Improved safety is one that came up for several groups, an increase in quality of life metrics for all neighborhoods. Several groups were very mindful of the connection between growth and land use planning on the one hand and transportation planning on the other hand. Sustained and inclusive economic growth and inclusive was an area of focus from the group that contributed that comment. A lot of you are still very conscious of the scale of this conversation and how we reach out to the broader region and develop a deeper sense of collaboration among cities, towns, and other actors like NCDOT, developers, and our residents. And then I think a comment that I thought was insightful that sort of underscores all of this is that we've been speaking a lot in qualitative terms so far in our conversations together. At some point, we need to shift and establish more quantitative metrics that articulate these expectations and give more specificity to the goals that we have in mind. Next slide. So this from David, Ernie, Kiba, and Raquel. The outcomes sort of in a nutshell for them that they would like to see: safer roads, less pollution, less congestion, better mass transit, and a healthier place to live. I think pretty succinct and profound there. Next slide. From Bill, Danielle, David, and Stefania, ability for people to move about without requiring a single occupancy vehicle. That piggybacks, I think, on some of what we just heard from Pedro and Eric. Next slide. From Aaron, Geraldine, Nick, and Reggie, more people are taking different modes of transportation because it's convenient. You can get anywhere within the Beltway without getting in a car in a reasonable time. That was the vision that they cast for 20 years from now. So again, let me pause there and see if there's any conversation around that second question.
Anybody want to elaborate on any of those points? Okay. I did have a question. How do you begin to measure success in the system? Is it something, is it a gut feel that we think more and more people are riding transit and riding bikes and walking more? Is there a way, and maybe I'm asking the professionals here, how do we set goals to say we've been successful? Is it that we go from 80 to 90% car usage to half that in a period of time of 15 to 20 years? I'm sort of wondering, and maybe the task force may have some insights on that. How do we know if we ask this community to spend a certain amount of money to build these facilities, how are we going to tell whether we were successful? Is there a way to measure that? Are there goals that we would set? And if the goal, for example, was to end up with only 50% of the people making car trips, as opposed to 80 to 90% now, what amount of light rail do we have to build? What amount of bike trails do we have to build to achieve that? That's always been a question in my mind, particularly when we're going to ask folks to spend a lot of money to do these things.
Maybe I can speak to that, Mayor, before Task Force jumps on. Maybe Scott can add to that as well. I think if we can reduce or even totally zero out pedestrian fatality on our roads, that's one way to measure that. So maybe year by year, how much reduction we have in pedestrian fatalities. Two, we have a goal in our strategic energy action plan to be a carbon neutral city, right? By so and so year. So as we track that, how much percentage of reduction in emissions are we having that results in better air quality? If we can go from, I think the average headways between our bus services right now is roughly between 45 to 60 minutes. If people can ride buses and those buses come every 10 to 15 minutes or rail, that right now is about 9 minutes or so. If we can get that to be 3-5 minutes and people know they don't even need to look at their phones before, in other words, frequencies get better on our system. If we can say that we move down to about 50% or so of people who use automobile versus those who drive, I think those are ways by which you can measure, but also one way that we can measure is on the equity spectrum, that people are really able to get better paying jobs simply because there's a means of transportation that gets them there. Right. And because they are limited by that. So maybe that's a way to start it off from a technical point of view, but I don't know what the task force feels about that.
Very interesting.
Tyrone, it's Betty, the mayor, Betty Doster. wouldn't another factor to be to reduce the commute time? When the commute time or, car, you mentioned it in the bus or rail, but also the drive time. So if you have fewer cars, the ones that do still have to drive, or, I mean, we will always have cars, reducing that commute time is an important factor, I would assume, to measure.
Mhm. This is Sonia. I'd like to add to that when you start talking about the electrical vehicles, and just as Betty said, reduce the amount of cars on the road. One of the things that we could measure from the health standpoint is the quality of our air. I think you would say Charlotte's Center City campus, they had an exhibit on the side of the building where they were measuring, I guess, the air quality. I can't remember what it was, but anyway, that's something that could be measured. And one other thing that struck me as we were going through this process was the upward mobility. Charlotte's ranking, we were like, I think 50 out of 50. And so I'm thinking that the things that we're doing regarding transportation, like you just said earlier about getting better jobs, that our ranking, that's something that we could see some immediate results from as far as that's concerned. Those are two things I just want to lay out on the table that may be measurable.
Thank you. Carl?
Yes. I think if you go back to the mission statement of Mayor Lyles, it comes down to improving the environment. We talked about measuring air quality, taking cars off the road. That could come down to a measurable about how many cars are on the road or time spent at a light. And then improving, and then she talks about a healthy city. Not sure how you exactly measure healthy city, but it would be a good way to kind of say this is where we're at and we want to make it healthier by 10 or 20%. The same thing with cars off the road. And the last one is providing opportunities for walking and biking. And at the Carolina Thread, we just measured the number of people that were on the trails by just indicators. You would pass through a light beam and measure how many people actually on the trail. So you could just say you want to have so many more people riding or walking on trails by 50% within 5, 7, 10 years. Thank you.
Can I jump in again? Getting back to what you were talking about, the biking and the trails, and being able to measure through our health system. We could look at see how it may be long range, but we could look at. I don't know if we'll be able to say there's a direct correlation, but it would be good if we could do that. More people riding bikes, more people walking, the air quality in the city, measuring whatever that is in the city, all those things affecting us as far as our bottom line in our health, examinations. We could maybe, I know this may be far-fetched, but I'm just thinking that bottom line health results being measured as well.
I think that's a very good point you're making, Sonia. Pedro?
Yes.
Did you want to comment?
Oh, no. I've been listening. I think I added comments in the chat.
Okay, Eric?
Yeah, one thing I would add in the task force recommendation to Mayor Lyles is that maybe we make sure some of the local metrics, such as, and I know with bike counting, could be expanded throughout the city, so we know more levels of biking that is happening and built into the ask for the infrastructure. And that could go along with additional counts for transit use as well, and maybe the trails and greenways. I think that should be built into the whole ask of this transformational network, because in order to know if we're successful, we need to know what's being counted. And as far as some of the larger items like quality of life, 50 best cities to move to or retire to, we'll let the national, polls and scales and once we do this, that they will fall in order, and we could use those as additional metrics as well. But I think, at least setting aside funding for, making sure that we are counting the infrastructure properly, that we are adding to the city is a must-have.
Okay.
Mayor,
That's an
this is
interesting.
sorry.
Yes.
Mayor, this is Janet LeBar. I also think we should think about the innovation side of this. And, the Charlotte region is a growing technology hub. And when you think about an integrated mobility system, an increased usage of people using various apps to plan their different trips, could be another indicator of time efficiency and how connected the region is based on where they're going.
Thank y'all for that feedback. Anybody else? There is an interesting comment that Aaron, Geraldine, Nick, and Reginald made regarding, oh, you see it on the screen there. More people are taking different modes of transportation because it's convenient. That's probably something that sticks in my mind. Convenient. That is, I think the standard has been to be able to go from your house and within 10 minutes be at a point that gets you on one of these systems, one of these modes to get to all the others.
If I may add, Mr.
Okay.
Manager, this is Raquel Lynch. I think the number of metrics, indicators that we share are really important. One outcome that is behavioral in nature and it becomes part of how we build and expand our city will be great to see, is to see that when we actually develop or we plan to grow and develop this community, we will not develop any community without a multimodal transportation in mind. So I think that will be a great indicator, not only of what we value, but how we now plan.
Thank you.
Mayor, this is Bill. If I may add, I started typing it and I was unsuccessful, but there are a lot of reasons we move around on the face of the earth. The commute that's been mentioned is simply one of those reasons, represents maybe a third of the trips that are made on a daily basis, and the other trips are made for many other purposes, to school, to recreation, to take a child somewhere for additional opportunities. And that brings us back to the land use. You cannot hope to make purposeful trips on foot or on bike if those destinations are not close to you, not for a large number of people at least. So we have to think again about scattering. We see this with the dearth of fresh foods in some parts of our community. People can't get to those opportunities without going long distances. So think about how we distribute the land use as well.
Thank you for that insight. All right.
There is, Your Honor, there is one other comment I'd like to make, and that is, and I mentioned this before, it's that last and first mile that Bill was mentioning, is how to, that last and that last mile, that first mile is critical, particularly for the other abled members of our community, for those of us that are aging and our mobility becomes more difficult. And so if the closer we can get the modes of transportation to residents and to people, the more likely, particularly multi-modes of transportations other than cars, so public transportation, the more likely they are to be utilized, particularly by those folks that can't afford a car or can no longer drive and can't walk too far or can't bike, but need some sort of motorized, electrified transportation system.
That 10-minute walk is crucial in terms of what you connect to. And it is very crucial. I don't know how far, whether it should have been a 5-minute walk, but 10 minutes seems to be crucial. And I can look quickly at any map in the city, and there are large numbers of people who are not even close to 10 minutes to some form of transit. Thanks for bringing up the fact that elderly people might think of 10 minutes as being the outer limits of how far they can go to get to a system. Anyway, it is not easy. It is not a cakewalk to measure how successful we can be, but we can try to achieve those goals in a way that will make the system truly transformational.
Mayor,
yeah.
one more comment. Maybe I missed this one, but one thing is just getting a representative sample of our people and surveying them, a customer satisfaction. What's the customer experience? That would be a good way of knowing we are successful or not.
I wish I could, who's talking?
This is Reg Henderson from Lowe's.
Hi, Reg. I'll tell you what you can do to help me, all of you. As you begin to speak, can you just say your name again? And that will help me. Some of you are sending it in and I'm catching it, but we're struggling with this virtual thing, but I like the conversation as it's going forward, but just tell me who you are when you speak up. Can we move on? Are there any other points people want to make on those issues of accessibility and convenience and measurement of how successful we are? Scott, I'll go back to you.
Thank you, Mayor. So the third question on your homework was to try to help us work through how we might fill up each of these major categories that we suggested to you all last month with potential programs and projects. So just as a reminder, those 6 categories were rapid transit, a bus priority system, our greenway network, our pedestrian system, our bicycle network, and our roadway network. Next slide. So here's some of what we heard about that rapid transit category. Prioritizing light rail was a common theme among all of you, with high capacity regional corridors also being something that several groups mentioned. A couple of groups mentioned something that we haven't talked about to this point, which is a high-speed rail linking Charlotte to other cities well beyond our region. Talking about true bus rapid transit and connecting to our large employers, plans to support future connections to surrounding counties, even if we don't make those connections today, making sure that we are setting ourselves up to connect in the future to the broader region. Next slide. For the bus priority system, there was some discussion about how we might repurpose our existing roadway space to incentivize alternative travel and improve bus efficiency. Increasing high frequency bus routes beyond the few that are existing and planned is something that was mentioned. Some groups noted that we need more and better bus shelters as a way to make riding the bus more convenient, and similarly a desire to be able to track buses in real time as a way to make riding the bus more convenient and appealing. Next slide. This from Elias, Jim, and Sonia. Prioritize electric light rail and repurpose some lanes on existing roads for incentivized travel. Next slide. Within the Greenway network, there was talk about the Cross Charlotte Trail, that north-south spine, but also not ignoring the rest of the Greenway network that Mecklenburg County and the city have planned to complete that network and then also connect to the broader Carolina Thread Trail system that extends beyond the county. Next slide. For the pedestrian network, we've already heard a little bit about this today, focusing on connections that complete first and last mile gaps in our network. There was some conversation about how might we use shared use paths as both pedestrian and bike infrastructure. A group mentioned that street trees is something that should be a key part of our pedestrian infrastructure because it serves not only pedestrian comfort, but also concurrent goals that we have within the CAP and elsewhere. And then some other groups mentioned this idea of micromobility hubs to access different forms of transportation and then being mindful of the maintenance of our pedestrian network. Next slide. Under the bicycle network, there was more conversation around micromobility, and that term means a lot of different things to different folks. And it's inclusive of bicycles. It also includes e-scooters and bike share and other things. It's a pretty broad term in your eyes and something that seemed to fall within this bucket. commuting was a big focus of this. I think we have a really strong greenway system that's used for recreation, and there was a recognition among you all that recreation isn't the only thing that we should be shooting for with our bike network. We need to be able to support commuting and also focusing on facilities for all ages and abilities. Next slide. Within the roadway network, there was definitely a focus on safety, mention of pedestrian safety and intersections in particular. A couple of groups I thought were very insightful in recognizing that because of our historic patterns of development, we don't have a regular and connected street grid like a lot of our peer cities do. And that's something that challenges us from a connectivity standpoint. So stitching together that street grid and building new streets to increase connectivity is something that you all brought up. Maintenance, again, was another topic within this bucket. And then a group mentioned a desire to redesign maybe some of our roads through residential areas to be less like highways and more about moving people. And then some suggestions for roads that might fall into those types of categories. Next slide. And then this last slide, just like last month, we included sort of a catch-all. These are other key thoughts that didn't fit neatly into the other prompts, but that we thought bared mentioning to you all. This first comment I thought was very insightful, that some buckets are obviously going to be a lot more capital intensive than others. And so we need to figure out a way to do the big projects while leaving enough room to do the other projects within the other buckets and find some quick wins. Ensuring operations and maintenance budgets keep pace with whatever expansions in facilities and services, I thought was another great comment that you all brought forward. More thinking around the transit system as it relates to our fare structure. Is there an aspiration or a need to rethink that in the future? How can we shift perceptions of transit? And then lastly, which may be a good segue to what Kelly is going to walk us through, there was just some conversation around what types of funding options we might have available to support this that maybe we already use or that we don't use and might consider in the future. So Mayor Gant, I'll hand it back over to you for any more conversation.
You said a lot, as a matter of fact, you folks said a lot in terms of your homework. And I was wondering whether or not, well, a couple of things that came up, talking about best practices. Somebody said, one of the comments I think was, we ought to think beyond just the best practices that we see in other cities. I guess we got some examples of that with the three cities that we examined, Austin, Broward County, and Nashville, in terms of how their bond referendums went forward. But I was just wondering, does anybody on the task force have or could put forward an example of a city that really has, I don't want to use the word transformational, that's our word, a great transit system, New York or Cleveland or Atlanta? Does anyone want to speak to a city that they went to that they were actually impressed? And I guess it doesn't have to be in this country, but I prefer it being an American city. Eric, is that your hand going up?
Yes, Mayor, it's Eric. I would have to say it's a close neighbor, but I think on this continent, Vancouver, British Columbia would be probably the gold star in this hemisphere as far as, you know, its transportation, its mode share goals. They were surpassed and they moved the bar up higher to achieve them, to push, you know, further in splitting walking and biking and transit from car ridership. So I think that would probably be my best.
That's pretty good. I visited Vancouver last year, and I must say, I didn't pay any attention to a system as much as I paid attention to the convenience of getting to some locations that I wanted to get to. And it wasn't very difficult to do. And obviously, we had no automobile to use. So it was pretty good. It's good that you point that out. Is there anybody else? Carl?
Yeah, I spent quite a bit of time in Portland, Oregon, and it just astounded me that they have over 300 and some miles of greenway biking trails, and I think Charlotte's at 58 or 60 or something like that. They also, I mean, it's just an amazing. And then the MAX system, which is I think 7 or 8 lines now, you can basically move around the whole city, get to the airport, along the riverfront, and cross back over, and then go east or west. And they have 14 bridges across the Willamette River, and almost all of them have bicycle paths added to the bridges, hanging off the bridges. They actually built a floating dock system because they couldn't figure out how to go along the river. So they said, screw it, we're just going to build a floating dock system that goes up and down the river and bikes go on it. And you just cannot barely get on these trails on the weekends. I mean, it's just, and the bike trails themselves have light systems. So when you come up to it, it'll sense you're coming and stop the traffic. And so it's extremely safe, and it connects, the whole town is connected. You can live in Happy Valley, Clackamas, it doesn't matter where, and you can get around town. And every MAX has places to hang your bikes inside so they're safe. And it's, I think it's kind of I think I've been to Vancouver too. It's amazing. They have the three bike lanes, one for rollerblading, one for scooters, and one for biking. And they've just got a planned system. So I think if we could find a system that feels right, that can transfer to Charlotte, we would really be able to set a tone for what we're looking at doing.
Janet, I see you smiling when they talked about Portland.
I was
Would
going to
you
add to
agree?
what Carl was saying. Carl, I moved here to Charlotte from Portland. I lived there for 5 years. Amazingly, I never got on a bike. You have to be like a road warrior to and I was not, but I did take advantage of the MAX and the streetcar and the light rail. And, you know, I would agree the integrated system that they have there, the pedestrian paths. I mean, they had the first bridge, maybe it was the last project that the federal government had technically earmarked funds for, but basically didn't allow cars, but buses, bicycles, pedestrians, light rail could all go onto this bridge. And so it's a very well-connected region, even beyond the city limits.
Very good. Anybody else? Okay, I guess we need to move on with the agenda. Kelly Flannery, who is the Chief Financial Officer for the City of Charlotte, is going to now take the stage to talk a little bit about the public mobility funding options that we might look at, or what they may have done historically and perhaps might be doing as we go forward. Kelly?
Thank you, Mayor Gant. Thank you, Taiwo, for the invitation. It's a privilege to be here. As you said in your opening remarks, anything transformational has got to be large in scale, and the funding and financing options, they're going to need to be big as well. And this evening's presentation is going to be an overview of how the city has both traditionally funded and financed mobility projects and provide examples of opportunities for us to be innovative. I think the way I'm looking at this is kind of showing you the tools in the toolbox, but reminding you we're going to need more tools. So keep an open mind. And I've been told that this kind of information is really dense. I find it fascinating, but if we need to stop probably in the middle and do some questions, then I think that might make some sense. So okay, great. So any successful mobility strategy will have to combine options that produce enough money to support the obligations and have the support of the community. And mobility funding is complex. Funds come from different revenues through many sponsors, but the big three are the federal, the state, and the local. The federal government has an essential role, and historically kind of always has, in supporting construction and expansion of mobility funding. The future size and strength of the federal program is unclear. That's because of obviously the current climate in Washington, dwindling receipts from fuel, taxes, and a lack of consensus on the goals. But at the same time, we've seen over the last several years, the federal government has expanded low-cost interest loans for highway and transit projects. Federal loans and financing options do help supplement the federal grants. And the grants have provided significant funds, but they require a lot of local and state commitment, and they're extremely competitive. The state, and not just North Carolina, all states are often focused more on highway projects. And while the federal government has an established grant program, the states generally regionally and opportunity-based. And we know for sure that the federal and state awards will not cover the cost of whatever plan we come up with. We will have to raise revenue. We will have to be innovative and think of new options to fund mobility. Next slide. So in the next slides, I'm going to present traditional and innovative local options for financing and funding. But I think when I was looking at the group here, very diverse backgrounds. So I'm just going to go real elementary. So for some of you, this might be really redundant, but I want to start off by just defining some terms. When I talk about local, it doesn't necessarily have to mean just city. When I'm saying local, it's really anything other than federal and state. So local could mean city, county, multi-counties. All that is when I'm referring to local. We will need local dollars. I think I'm going to say that every time we turn a slide. We need options. And then what I mean by financing versus funding, I think the easiest way to define that is financing is the process which we get the money. Funding is how we pay that process back. So if you think of when you go and buy a house, typically you would get a mortgage, but maybe you've got a friend who wants to give you a loan. That's the financing. How you are paying that back, you know, if you are depending on lottery winnings or if you have job earnings, that revenue is the funding source. So on that slide there, these are the sources the city has typically used to finance mobility capital projects. The first is general obligation bonds. When we issue general obligation bonds, that's the full faith and credit of the city. So while we typically use property tax revenues to pay it back, it's any available dollar of the city that's not committed. It's typically a lower risk and lower interest rates, which would, you know, result in lower financing costs. When we issue GO bonds, we must get voter approval via referendum. That's typically done every 2 years. And when we determine the size of the issuance, we have to contemplate the expected increase in the property tax revenue from growth and the impact on the city's credit ratings. And the credit ratings are important because it determines the price we will pay for that borrowing. Very similar to GO bonds are certificates of participation, or COPs. They are secured by and paid by the general revenues of the city, but they also have an additional collateral attached to it. Typically, whatever property we are, or project we are funding is the collateral for that certificate of participation. Same considerations of GO bonds. How is it going to impact the city's credit rating? And then the third option here is the federal loans. The government has programs that provide low interest loans to fund mobility projects. As I mentioned before, there is competition for these loans, and these loans are also, as we've currently used them, again, backed by the full faith and credit of the city. And as we learned from the Blue Line project, the greater the local match, the more likely it is to get approved for one of these loans. On the next slide, when I say innovative, I don't just mean we're creating innovative new ideas. Some of these ideas are just new to Charlotte and the region, things we've never done here before but have been successful nationwide. So the first thing is the concept of a regional authority. There could be an advantage to the creation of a more regional entity that would cover a broader geography. It would likely be an independent entity with representation from whatever the related governments are. And this would be beneficial not just to the city, but to the authority, because we'd have the ability to dedicate revenue and issue debt from that authority. Of course, that requires state authorization, but I don't think it's unheard of. Second is revenue bonds. The city issues revenue bonds for water, stormwater, for airport, for all of its enterprise funds. These bonds are specifically secured by the revenue of the system. So the airport revenue pays for airport bonds, water revenue pays for water bonds. If those revenues fall short, the city's general revenues are not pledged. So if for some reason the airport never flew another flight and the money never came in, the city's not on the hook for the airport debt. In a lot of other cities and states, the most common form of funding transit projects is sales tax revenue bonds. Currently, we don't have the authority at the state level to issue sales tax secured bonds. This is something that we would need to look at getting a state legislative change to do. And I talked about in the prior slide was the federal loans is the traditional source. And we used the TIFIA loan, which was a program, I think back in 2008, maybe it started. It was the Transportation Infrastructure, pardon? Oh, Transportation Infrastructure Finance and Innovation Act, which I'm pretty sure, I'm gonna give him credit regardless, Obama did it. I don't know if he really did, but I'm pretty sure he did. But it was it's loans to fund a portion of projects at low interest costs. So we used it on the blue line. The loan is backed by the city. Where we could be innovative is if we created an authority, we wouldn't have to bind the city's credit as the backstop. It could be the authority, which would minimize the city's credit rating exposure and provide a more regional approach to the issuance. Finally, there might be projects that are ideal for P3s, public-private partnerships. This would allow the city to shift some of the financial and delivery risk to a third party. These partnerships generally come at a higher cost of capital, but because they're able to be more efficient delivery-wise, that cost can come down a little bit and can mitigate some of the increased costs. So that was a lot. So maybe, Mayor Gann, I paused there.
Why is it that you said public-private partnerships tend to be more efficient in delivery?
Government's a bureaucracy. Sometimes we can't get out of our own way. They're able to move through procurement processes faster than we are most of the time.
Okay.
Your Honor, I have a comment I'd like to make regarding this portion of it. My comment is a cautionary one. Robert Moses created an authority in New York City that was not very democratic. He ended up wielding a significant amount of power. And so if there is going to be an authority created, there has to be checks and balances to help control and manage the power that could be wielded by whoever's in charge of that authority. I would just caution everyone to take a little history lesson and look at what Robert Moses did with the authority he had in New York City and the tri-state area, and how much he was able to tear down communities because there were no checks and balances on his power.
Pedro, I hear you. Yes?
Sorry, Mayor Gann, this is Geraldine Gardner. I just have a quick question for Kelly about the innovative financing tools slide. Kelly, I'm new to North Carolina, but I was just wondering if this is a state that allows for tax increment financing districts, and if that's something that you all have looked at as a possible tool.
So I was torn on that, whether it was a financing tool or a funding tool. So you're going to see it in the funding section, but it is something that North Carolina allows-ish.
Okay.
We'll get into it.
Any other questions? This is a very important.
Yeah, I have a quick question.
Yes.
Yes, I was wondering, part of the Opportunity Zone conversation about a year ago, and there were some investors that suggested that that they were investing heavily in opportunity zones in the form of transit investment, and I wanted to ask, had that been an avenue or resource that had been researched by the city?
To the extent of my knowledge of opportunity zones, is the advantage is it provides private developers to kind of borrow at a lower tax rate. Because we are a government, we're already tax exempt, so there would be no benefit for the city to be in that pot. But I don't know, because it's a private enterprise, I don't know how successful there have been in the development side here. I don't know, Ty, if you know any opportunity zones.
Well, the example that the group that was presenting used was I think they did a project in Boston, if I'm not mistaken, and it was a streetcar project, and they were investing in it in that way. And so they were using their capital to invest in areas that were considered to be opportunity zones, whereby, the return on their investment could yield certain tax benefits. So it wasn't necessarily that the city in of itself was the investor, but they were investing in the city and solving and filling a gap that the city had in a financial way. And also receiving those tax benefits, obviously.
So they were putting up the money for the streetcar?
Correct, correct. So they were investing
Because they were building an even larger development around that streetcar.
Well, not necessarily that they were, commingling projects, but they were particularly investing in transportation in that way to build out the streetcar there and receiving the tax benefits that come along with investing in opportunity zones. Because they realize, just like we're discussing now, that resources and funds are scarce at times. And so in order to fill that gap and also benefit financially, it just made sense.
Okay.
Right. This is Sonia. That kind of feeds into a narrative that I've been kind of like in our small groups have been kind of touting all along, is because I look at like companies like Lowe's. It benefits them to be able to get their people to work and get them there on time and get them home, and other companies like that. And so them investing in the transportation, in our transportation system, is not only beneficial to them, but it's beneficial to the community as a whole, because it takes some of the heavy lifting off of our backs.
A little bit frustrated because I can't see who's talking. Anyone else want to comment on that at this point? So we got Kelly again.
Okay. So next slide, I guess. So we talked about financing. Let's talk about funding. When we're looking at new funding sources, it's really best practice for any time you're doing anything financing wise is to kind of just develop evaluation criteria or guardrails to make sure the long-term goals of the project are being met. So these are the ones that we kind of operate under when it comes to funding sources, and they're fairly self-explanatory. Potential revenue, how much revenue will the source yield? Is there going to be enough money to make debt payments? And when we look at potential revenue, we look at the natural constraints or limits to the amount of money that can be generated. For stability and predictability, this is a required component for planning and budgeting. Some sources are going to fluctuate from year to year where others are more reliable. Obviously, equity is pretty self-explanatory. We're not burdening one group unfairly. Political feasibility, and by that, I don't just mean political support, but all stakeholders. Is the public going to be accepting of the funding options? And we expect to do that kind of work through surveys and public consultations. And honestly, this task force, I think, shows the commitment that we have to making sure this is feasible. And then geography, as we talked about, is the revenue source city, county, multi-county, regional? What does it look like? So next slide. As we look at the traditional local funding sources, obviously property tax is one that we've relied on. It's extremely stable funding source. The challenge for me, maybe not for you guys as much, as you're competing with other city priorities there. The sales tax, currently in Charlotte, there's the 1/2 local cent sales tax that's funding transit investments through CATS. An additional sales tax could generate robust revenues, especially on a region-wide basis. It would require state and voter approval through a referendum. As I mentioned, this is a very common source of funding mobility projects in many states. The registered motor vehicles tax within the city of Charlotte, there's an assessed $30 fee, which is currently at its statutory maximum authorized by the state. Most of the revenue that is collected goes to CATS for their maintenance of operations efforts and operational support. While not a super robust revenue source, we're not just funding capital, we have to think O&M costs. These are the kind of things that, well, not super helpful right now, helpful keeping things going in the long run. So an increase to this revenue source would also require state authorization. Advertising and concession revenues, that's just the opportunity to get revenue from advertising on vehicles or stations, sponsorship on greenways. Limited potential additional revenue, but there's a lot of different places you could put it. So if you're thinking about, who is it, Blue Cross Blue Shield, who has the shared bikes here, all of those dollars start to matter when you think of all the opportunities there. Fare box, so additional revenues from fare increases. Very difficult to predict because as you increase the fares, there is some ridership that's going to fall off, and determining that delta can be difficult. Once you've figured it out and you're comfortable with it, it's usually pretty level, but making those predictions is difficult. And then you have to go back to the guiding principles, and we have to be thoughtful about maintaining equity and affordability for customers when we're contemplating fare box revenues. Next slide. So the next one, I think, based on your previous comments, the ones you guys are most interested in, and transit-oriented development, or the TOD fees. These would apply to new development. Potentially revenue is dependent on the amount of the development occurring in the region, and the predictability here is also highly variable depending on how it would be applied in the amount of qualifying development that occurs. We have the authority, we have designated TODs. We haven't come up with a way to monetize them yet. I think there's opportunity here, but it's really project specific, and without the details of a designated project, it's really hard to kind of quantify what that looks like. Land sales, leases, swaps, again, very project specific. The revenue would be minimal, dependent on location and other economic factors. And frankly, the purpose of the land would likely create a debate depending on who the owner was. I'm thinking if it's city-owned land, we have a lot of priorities here. I could see a cat fight over if it's for affordable housing or if it's for mobility. It's a nice to have, but it's not going to be a huge generator. I think where we see the most opportunity is what we call value capture district, which is really the same thing as TIF. It's also called project development financing, depending on what state you live in, but it's all TIF. It's the area surrounding potentially a station or whatever your project area is, and you value the property at a value, and whatever increment is generated off of it goes to either repay the debt or capital costs, whatever your purpose is. It kind of requires whoever's building in that area around is going to have to pay for being in that area. And it could be moderate to a really large potential revenue windfall over the end, but it is dependent on the project area. And the initial revenue projections are difficult to predict because it's not stable at first. You don't really know if the growth is going to show up, especially when you look at times like this where no one thought COVID was coming, but when you're borrowing money, you have to pay it back regardless. Those revenue sources are a lot more volatile. And the other thing I didn't put up there, because it kind of violates my own principles, but I think it can be meaningful, is private funds. I think what you saw in 2018, which was the first year that the city put a $50 million bond referendum out there for housing, you saw the private sector show up with a $50 million match. And that's money, that's real money, and it matters. And I don't know how you quantify it, I don't know how you rely on it, but Charlotte's a giving community. And I think there's real evidence that we could see people donating in a meaningful way to some of these projects. I come from a very large city, and there was a billionaire who liked to ride his bicycle, and he didn't like to share his bike path with pedestrians. So he donated $15 million to build a bike lane on the walking trail. There are people who have money and want to give it. So it's not something to be cavalier about because it can become something. And the next slide is just meant to show, next slide. There are different funding sources for different projects. And while all dollars are green, there are ways to put the best money to work in the best projects. There is also some PAYGO funding that isn't represented here as well. But I just wanted to show that on a project by project basis, there's opportunity to use both the traditional sources and innovative sources that are new to the city here. So with that.
Kelly, I think it almost feels like I'm drinking from a fire hose right now.
I feel like I prefaced
I'm not sure
that.
The task force is not. But the most informative slide to me, if you begin to understand all of the various sources of revenue and financing, ways that we would do it, is this last slide that you've got up.
That's Ty's
Talk
favorite
about-
one too.
Hmm?
That was Ty's favorite one.
Yeah, it actually does help a lot to see what the possibilities are. I think someone might have raised the question on the task force, so I got this from somewhere that says, are there other ways? And I know you just got a lot of information, but is there anybody on the task force that has or is aware of another way that a city or region raised money to support a system?
I see some comments in the chat box. I think Nick Margetta said something about HumaCall raising money.
I'm sorry, I can't read it.
Yeah, so maybe we call on Nick Margettas.
Nick?
Thank you, Mayor. I just wanted to raise a point to when we were talking about private donors that if you circle back for those that are new to Charlotte, before we had the transit center, we used to catch the bus at the corner of Trade and Tryon. Later on, Hugh McCall, who worked at Trade and Tryon at the now Bank of America Center, did finance I believe it was at $8.5 million to build the transit center we know today, just a few doors down where we now catch the bus. So definitely Charlotte has been huge benefactors of private investment in our transit and other projects. So just a nod to the fact that private investment has gone a long way in getting things built around Charlotte. Thank you.
Thank you for that input. You're right. That shows how old I am. It goes way back. I remember the whole episode. In fact, our architectural firm did the design. Other comments on the financing? Lots of options out there. When we start thinking about the magnitude of this, billions of dollars, we may be taking from lots of different buckets. Is it possible, Kelly?
Yeah, I think that's the one takeaway is there is no one right revenue source.
I do think that the system ought to be publicly generated. That is, that it comes from government, the network, the system itself. I'm a little concerned, however, that if we started to say, let's finance half of this with private funds and another half of it with public funds, we'd have to be very careful about that. So I feel much more comfortable that publicly generated financing really reaches and seeks to reach the entire community. That's not to say that we ought to be turning away someone who wants to put $1 billion in this because they like riding bikes in a certain location. If they put the bikes, if they're supporting the bikes from a plan that was generated by the municipality or the regional authority or whatever going forward. All right. Is that what we're going to get on funding tonight? But we're going to dig into this deeper in the upcoming days when we try to match.
Yeah, I'm not sure if
That's
Scott or
cost.
Stephen.
I think Stephen would.
Yeah, Mayor, this is Stephen Stansberry. I think that was a really great presentation and good dialogue. And Kelly, thank you for digging in and helping us at least know a little bit more about how it is that we go about funding these projects over time. It seems like some logical next steps for us is to do a little bit more homework on behalf of the task force. And so one of the things we've been talking about as a team, to your earlier question, is are there other things that we could learn from peer communities? I know we've done some peer community research thus far, but it was more about how they were going about developing their strategies. I think in this instance, we'd like to maybe dig a little bit deeper and just see how others are approaching the funding and finance side in particular. So we're willing to do that on behalf of the task force if there's interest. The other things that we know that we ultimately need to own is the identification of some kind of recommended approach. It's one thing to have a strategy, a set of projects. It's another charge for us that we've clearly been given to identify how we might proceed with at least some logical steps with which to financially support them. And so we're going to need to dig in deep, like Kelly suggested, investigating a bit more about innovative financing options. It's pretty clear after listening that we don't have all the tools necessary to be successful right now. That means we may need to send people on that journey with the responsibility of helping us to establish those tools. And then next to maybe do the same with the funding options here locally. We keep throwing around these terms like regional authority. I think that those are all tied together with A and B. But at the end of the day, I would fully expect that our recipe for success includes all three of those items in tandem together. So be looking from us as a technical team to be bringing that back to the task force in subsequent meetings.
That will be very helpful. Eric, did you want to make a comment?
Yes, Mayor. I just put in the chat that it may be helpful too, just to see separating out some of those options that we have the low-hanging fruit, the ability to do ourselves, and then separate out the other ones that are going to require more work. Stephen was kind of mentioning that would need state approval or creation, just to see what that is compared. And then the other point was just, doing this funding using multiple options, obviously I think would make sense. We just want to make sure that I think it's evenly distributed, maybe in a way that, you don't feel like the residents wouldn't feel the burden or overburdened by it. If it's done maybe in a correct way, we can use some of these tools, add some tools, and do it in a way that it's almost unfelt and is not controversial.
Okay. Stephen, I'm glad you interjected that comment because it also is a good lead into your state of the mobility report. I'm moving on to
Mayor, this is Janet Labar. I have one more question. It's maybe more of a process question. Can we talk a little bit more about the responsibility of this task force in the funding piece? I appreciate that Kelly really distilled that for us in simple terms, and feel more assured that Stephen is going to be the technical expertise for this body, because I'm not sure that I feel fully confident in being a funding or finance expert when it comes to transportation mobility plans. But can you just give us a sense of how much of the responsibility this group will have in making the recommendations for funding?
Well, I think we're going to plow through a lot of that in the upcoming meetings, because at the end of the day, the most important aspect of this is what kind of a recommendation we would make to the political bodies, the mayor and the council. We want to be very well informed of what we're talking about at the appropriate time to do that. But ultimately, at the end of the day, Janet, it is going to be the mayor and the council that will make a decision as to whether they will go forward with any recommendations we want to make. I just want to make sure that we made one that was well thought out, or as good as we could make to them for something that will be transformational, and that they understand the relationship between transformational and cost and our recommendation. Now, at that point, the mayor says, good work, task force. Now we have to do the other piece of that, is to see how we go forward. And if you look in that timeline that we showed earlier, there's almost a whole year that is going to happen. We're finished in January, December, somewhere around there. We don't get to some proposition put before the community until the latter part of 2021. And if I can bet you that most of 2021 is going to be dealing with how we fund it. That's going to be the issue. It's not going to be the quality of the plans and what we're putting forward. It is going to be how we fund it. And I hope this task force will help to continue to influence it by the recommendation we make.
Geraldine and Phil.
Mr. Mayor, this is David Ward. I certainly appreciate that. I think when I think in terms of transformational, I'm thinking big picture and big ticket items, and that equals significant funding requests. I'm a little bit concerned that a year from the time we make our recommendations at the end of 2020 to, you know, a goal for funding at the end of 2021 may be aspirational. There's no recommendation in there. That's just a comment.
Okay. Well, let's remember that you thought it might be aspirational to talk about, what are you saying, aspirational in the sense?
It may be a bridge too far, frankly.
In other words,
yes, sir.
what you're saying is we may not arrive at a funding scheme for this for 5 years?
I'm not sure 5. I would think 1 to 3 would be more reasonable. 5 would be great, but that's probably too long to put off the goals that we want to achieve from this task force. I think 1 year is possibly unrealistic if we're going to do something as big as the things we're discussing right now.
All right. Thank you for that comment. We have Geraldine. Did I have?
Yes, Mr. Mayor. Sorry about that. I just put into the chat that, you know, we'd welcome at Central Atlanta Regional Council the opportunity to help the team coordinate the kind of evaluation of the regional authority concept to help better align with the work that we're doing and Connect Beyond. I think what I always come back to with this group is how we're defining regional. Because, you know, is that regional Mecklenburg? Is it regional, sort of our definition of region, which is 9 counties and around Charlotte? Is it Janet's definition of regional, which includes South Carolina and I think 14 counties you are, Janet? So I think helping to really define what we're meaning by regional and then how that translates into a governance structure. I think we're definitely open to the conversation. It just has to be aligned with all the other efforts to talk about these issues regionally. So I just want to put that on the table that we'd love to talk about that.
Thanks for that insight, Geraldine. The question of regional is an issue, but I'm not sure our charge is really to look at this county first and make sure that we're doing something that ties into what Connect Beyond may be doing and beyond. But the funding that I'm speaking of now, unless we go, I think, to an authority, which is going to be a totally different kind of challenge involving a larger region, my charge is to look at the county. That would be
so that's super helpful, Mr. Mayor. So are you, so just a point of clarification, when Stevens on the previous slide said regional authority, was that Mecklenburg County, or just help me understand how you all were using the word regional there so we can, maybe my comment's a mute point if you're just talking about Mecklenburg County. I'm not clear.
I'm not sure whether we would even end up with an authority. I think I don't want to get you too far off track with some new structure that we may be recommending to the council. That may be a possibility. But I think for our purposes, I need to keep thinking about the county and letting Central Atlanta Council and others know exactly what we're thinking about and coordinating what they're thinking about. And if this ends up being something bigger, which brings into play other governments in the region, then I think so. I think that would be the appropriate time. But we got to start somewhere, and we're starting with our own county, Charlotte, Mecklenburg, and what we can do in building the system out. And we need to make what we're doing, make the surrounding communities very much aware of what we're wanting to do. And then we can negotiate that at that point. At least that's the way I feel about it. That's the charge I've been given from the mayor.
So you have Bill and Eric.
Bill? Bill? See if I had Eric?
Yes, I just wanted to make a response to David's comment about, maybe this might be aspirational to accomplish anything by 2021. And I think, growth is not waiting. Are we going to stop people from coming to Charlotte? I don't think that's going to happen. We don't want that to happen. So I think, we need to start. Maybe a phased approach might work. The same thing with the comments just a minute ago about, is this Charlotte, Mecklenburg, multiple counties? I don't think there's anything that would maybe stop expanding in the future, adding to the authority or whatever the organization is. I think things could be built over time, but we have to start sooner, and we cannot wait any longer on these projects. And I think maybe even we bring some of these tools, we identify some of the low-hanging fruit, we get those before the voters. Maybe we do one or two of the ones next year we could work on. Then we could have maybe another initiative if we need to. If we communicate to the public that this is not a one and done kind of thing, that it's what we can do in a period of time we have, given everything we just went through in 2020. Maybe, that would be a compromise, if you want to call it, but maybe a smarter way of approaching just starting, adding, and expanding forward with financing, with organizations, with the region. So that's just my opinion on it.
Thank you, Eric.
And Mr. Mayor, if I can respond to Eric, I love that idea. I think bite-sized chunks is a great suggestion, because I think what we're talking about here from a comprehensive perspective is huge, and it needs to be huge, and it needs to be comprehensive. But if we're talking about something that's truly regional, what we're talking about is securing funding and approval for that funding, both from local and state authorities. And it would probably help to have some federal funds in there too. And these are things that, it's going to take convincing lawmakers in Raleigh that this is, worthy of funding, and that there's buy-in from the broader community. So Eric, to your point, I think you're right. I think if we could pick this apart, piece by piece, start small, get bigger, until we are able to realize the comprehensive nature of this plan, would be great. But I do think that once we get our arms around what this is ultimately going to look like and what we want to accomplish, we really need to start thinking about how we approach the funding for it, and what pieces do we want to work towards, in the immediate future, and then what's our goal for, a year, 2, 3, 4, 5 years down the road, and work towards that, probably in to your point, Eric, in smaller but impactful pieces.
All right, David, appreciate that point. Of course, I got the feeling here that that people may have different ideas about what this thing is going to cost, and I'd feel more comfortable with the discussion on how hard is it going to be to do this after we get some sense as to what this is going to cost. And I think if we put the cart before the horse, we're in some trouble. Let's find out what it's going to cost, and then decide whether we're going to be needing to do this in chunks or pieces or phases, or however you want to define it. I need to, in the interest of time, though, move on to allow Stephen to make this presentation on the state of the mobility report itself that they're working on. Stephen, where are you?
Thank you, Mayor. Can everyone see a cover that says the state of mobility on it? Should be coming right about now. Yes?
See it.
Great, great. Okay. So this has been a great dialogue. I'm going to try, in the interest of time, introduce this topic fairly quickly and just sort of recognize that we're building as we go on this task force initiative. And I know that in recent meetings, we've almost asked you to become very quick experts about all of our transportation plans here in Charlotte, and not just to be familiar with what they represent, but also even the projects that are contained within them. And I continue to thank you for the time and attention that you've given to that. It doesn't go unnoticed. And I think this past month, you began to get a flavor for how challenging it can be to take on the task of assembling a transformational mobility network, because it means something different to all of us. And if I were you, I would want more information. It's hard to make decisions. There's trade-offs and there's kind of things that are in the background that you know are going to be informing decisions as we go. And so with last month's homework, clearly you probably found yourselves wondering a little bit more about current trends and information. And I hate to say it, but you're probably going to see what I'm sharing with you tonight and wish you had it about 30 days ago. But we recognize that we need to continue to feed information that is relevant to your process. And in all candor, we could have generated an exhaustive existing conditions report, but we weren't real certain about how much utility it would have offered you. And so instead, we had the opportunity to listen very closely to the themes that you have begun to articulate as being kind of the driving forces behind how we might progress towards identifying a transformational mobility network. So in many ways, you've influenced the document that we just created. And our hope is that it becomes a continued resource for you as we kind of continue this journey together. And with that, I'm just going to make a quick acknowledgement. I'm not going to go over the entire document. I know that we've emailed it to all of you, but I want to introduce you to the document and generally how it's organized. And we would hope that you might see it as a resource as we continue forward. So you may be talking with some of your friends and coworkers about the work that you're doing on the task force, and maybe sometimes struggling at finding the exact words. And we wanted to also aid in that discussion. So like every good document, there's a nice preamble to this, and I hope that you'll review that and just become familiar with it as we continue to have meetings and discussions. But I think more importantly, you'll find that this document's organized with ease of use in mind. There's a whole section at the beginning that we've just entitled Setting the Stage that talks a lot about how we got to where we are today, that likewise speaks to some of our community characteristics as well as our travel characteristics. And that's an helpful piece of information because we continue to hear many of you point out about history, about land use, about upward mobility and access to opportunity. And so that whole first section really begins to set the stage for that. Now, the second section has many traditional transportation elements that you would expect to see as background information about how we travel, where we're traveling, how long it takes us to travel. But it also begins to speak to things like what's the relationship of that travel to jobs, and what's the relationship between jobs and access to some of our more pertinent travel modes like transit. And so I would hope that you find that there's a wealth of information about that. And then lastly, we continue to challenge ourselves to learn from other communities. And so we've offered, albeit brief, but a concise set of peer communities against a series of benchmarks. And so with that, I'm just going to quickly scroll through here for the benefit of the audience so that you can kind of see that this setting the stage is documenting all the driving forces that we need to be cognizant of as we move forward. I think with every meeting, as much as we want to say this is about 3 things, it's really about a dozen things, and it's complicated, and we know that. So we've done our best to try to showcase those things ranging from safety all the way to health and everything in between. I think that you'll also see that the emerging trends begins with that acknowledgement that so many of you often reference, which is the history of our city and in large part, many modern cities. And so while we're not going to dwell on the past, we need to know how we got to where we are today, and that becomes incredibly helpful. But we introduced this concept during past meetings about understanding how our community presently is organized. And many of us in the planning field acknowledge sort of the data showing us these two geographies of the arc that's in blue and the wedge. And there's some very distinct characteristics about each of those features within our community. And I'm not going to go over all of them today, but I think if you only have a few moments to scan through this document, you'll find that the sections about the arc and the wedge are incredibly helpful in understanding who we are and what we are as a community right now. And I want to also suggest to you that we want to make this easy. So as you move through the document, we've isolated the wedge so that you can see it on all of the maps. We're trying to think ahead and also think about how we might want to use the document as well. A really quick reminder about the arc and the wedge, and a simple way to say this is that the greatest degree of diversity in our community exists within this general arc. It's no coincidence that much of that arc is interrupted by large transportation facilities, in particular interstates and freeways. The wedge tends to be the most homogeneous and wealthy portion of our community as well. And that kind of information is just a piece of data, but it does begin to allow us to see some organizing themes about travel behavior and access to opportunity and methods with which we might want to seek to advance prioritization and project identification. We keep talking to you also using some planning terms like mode split and mode share. We owe it to you to explain that to you in greater detail. And so we've got a whole section in here entitled Travel Patterns and Mode. And when you see SOV, we're talking about single occupant vehicles. These are people driving in their cars. And so the big takeaway that we've referenced several times is that almost 77% of us when traveling to and from work are driving alone. And we know that that's one metric. It's not a single motivation for us, but it certainly is something for us to pay attention as we contemplate setting targets and goals. There's a lot of information in here that is not necessarily transportation related, but it's community characteristics, and they're tied together. I think all of us would, after reading this, agree that transportation, land use, and equity and prosperity are all tied together. And so we've begun to document not just about who lives where, but what are the cost burdens that we experience depending where we live in Charlotte. And that's directly related to things like housing cost and wages and a handful of other critical data points. And critical needs are clearly things that are important to us. And we know that there's priorities here, not just to be able to commute well to and from work, but to also have access to all the things that make living here both an enjoyable and prosperous thing for all of our residents. And so we're looking at things like how much access we have and what are our choices for getting to and from hospital health care, recreation, parks, open space, and the like. And so there's a lot of information in here that I think that you'll find that's incredibly interesting. But there was already reference this evening to that upward mobility report where Charlotte does rank 50th out of the 50 largest cities in the US. And a lot of that is influenced by a number of variables, but knowing where jobs are located helps us begin that discussion. And literally inventorying where our greatest density of jobs is located in our community is one moment in time for us to contemplate how we proceed in that conversation. I think it's worth noting here, everyone recognizes our 4 largest employment centers from University City to Uptown to South Park and Ballantyne. And it only takes a moment to recognize that only one of those large employment centers resides immediately within the arc. That's not exclusively the solution, but it is part of the dialogue. And so we want to be sure that we're understanding that. We do a lot of spatial analysis in work like this, which is just a fancy way of saying how close are people to different features. And we've done so with respect to access to transportation, and in particular, access to some of our more affordable options for transportation, be that walk, bike, and transit. We wanted that to be easily accessible for you. And once again, travel time. You mentioned, some of you tonight, even discussions about how long does it take for us to commute, and what does that compare to other places? And then how do we translate time to dollars? And so all that information's in here, and hopefully that will become something that helps feed your thoughts as we move through the remainder of this process. As I mentioned, I'm not going to go through the entirety of this, but I hope I've given you enough flavor to maybe stimulate your interest to read this, if not cover to cover, at least thematically for the areas with which you have the greatest interest. And I did mention earlier that we wanted to also give you a comparative analysis as well. It's one thing to know what we look like on paper and what the data shows us about who we are, but sometimes it's really helpful for us to compare ourselves to other places we have some experience with. And it's really interesting, the information that we were able to generate through this process. And you'll find that there's not any one community that exhibits just a perfect scenario. And we have our own externalities, and some of these other communities we've looked at have their own challenges as well. And so I think that there's something to be learned from that. But you'll note that there's some comparisons to Charlotte, Austin, Minneapolis, Nashville, and Denver consistently throughout. With that, I'm going to leave this just simply with the request. You've got this in your inbox. If you could take some time between now and the next meeting to familiarize yourself with the material. There's not a homework assignment beyond that for this, but I also hope that you'll begin to look to this document as a reference document. As you have questions, I would ask that maybe you look to the document first. It's possible that you may find an answer in that document, especially as we give future homework assignments and you're asked to work in small groups. And so hopefully that's a helpful addition to our work together. And I thank you for your contribution in us getting to this point. Are there any questions about that?
Thank you, Stephen. This has been very, very helpful. And given how diligent this task force has been, I'm sure that there will be some more questions generated by the time we get to the October 13th meeting. But very well done. Scott, you and Stephen were I'm sorry, were there any questions from the task force before we move to the next? All right, we're receiving that as information. Let's go to Scott and the polling that was done.
Thank you, Mayor. So next on our agenda, we want to walk you through some of the early results from the public survey that's out, and then kick it back over to you all to chime in with some live polling that Stephen's going to walk us through. So just as a reminder, we have this public survey out now. It is live. There's 33 questions. Hopefully you all have taken it, so you're familiar with this. Those questions are focused on transportation equity, mobility after COVID-19, trade-offs between different types of transportation, and then the mobility behaviors and preferences of our residents. We've gotten about 1,000 responses to date. Our respondents to date are skewing a little bit younger, within cohorts of 25 to 45 years old. They're also skewing towards people who identify as white or Caucasian, and skewing slightly female. That age and racial skew is not atypical for surveys like this, especially in the earlier weeks of distribution. But we think it's also a challenge to us as staff and to you all as task force members to do a little bit better. You all represent a broad and diverse set of voices across our city, and we need your help distributing the survey to all of the various communities that we serve. So part of your homework for next month is to help us distribute the survey. So please send the survey out to your personal and professional networks, to neighborhood leaders, to faith communities, to NGOs, to anyone else who you can think of that can help us to achieve a more diverse and representative sample of responses. We also want to take this moment to remind you all that we are not relying exclusively on this survey to inform our decision making. because we know that survey responses are sometimes not fully representative. So as a part of our public outreach strategy for the Charlotte Moves effort, we'll be assembling a transportation equity focus group to make sure that we're capturing the perspectives of the lost voices who often don't get a chance to fully participate in planning processes. So more to come on that. Next slide. So now I'm going to walk you through some of the highlights from these early responses. This first question is about the different challenges that we are facing now from a mobility standpoint. As a reminder, it's also a question that relates directly back to the vision statement for us that was established in the 2040 comprehensive plan effort. And you can see here in terms of priorities, safety and equity are consistently at the top. I think that reinforces a lot of what we've heard from you all. Also towards the top are issues of connectivity and sustainability. Next slide. And again, I'm just bringing this up on the screen so that you can see the 6 things from that question relate directly to the 6 themes that are underlined from our vision statement: safety, equity, sustainability, connectivity, prosperity, and innovation. Next slide. We've been asking a question about how easy residents feel it is to travel in Charlotte by different modes of transportation. By and large, folks think that driving a car is easier than any other mode in Charlotte right now. That shouldn't come as a big surprise to us. Followed by taking light rail, walking, e-scooters, bicycle, and then bus. Next slide. This is the question that hones in on part of that transportation equity story. We want to know how our residents think about where we spend our money, and we've gotten some really strong support for the idea that the city should focus transportation investments on improvements for the populations that are the most vulnerable and have the greatest need for affordable transportation options. Next slide. We've also gotten some really good early support for this idea that we might, through the Charlotte Moves process, establish a mode shift goal and then make more significant investments in the transportation modes that have been historically underinvested, like walking, biking, and transit. So we're seeing a large majority of respondents in favor of that idea as well. Next slide. We are eager to understand what impact the pandemic may have on our mobility future once we emerge from the reality that we are living in now. And so we've tried to craft some questions that get towards expectations and behaviors around post-pandemic mobility. This was one of those questions, and I think has some interesting early results. We're obviously not post-pandemic yet, so I want to point out that this reflects expected behavior as opposed to observed behavior. But what respondents are telling us is that there's about a 13% decrease right now in the number of folks who expect that they will be driving alone to work 5 or more days a week. Next slide. Similarly, there's about a 10% increase in the number of respondents who are telling us they will walk or ride a bike at least 3 or more days a week. Again, this is expected as opposed to observed behavior. It's sort of just our way of trying to begin to measure preferences and behaviors around this issue of post-pandemic mobility. Next slide. So with that, I'm going to kick it over to Stephen to navigate us through a little bit of live polling that will compare your attitudes and sort of measure how aligned we are as a task force with some of the other questions that we asked as a part of the public survey.
All right, great. So I'm back. I'll tell you that we're using you a little bit as a guinea pig tonight. So bear with us. We're going to beta test this. I've only got 3 questions. This won't take long, but we want to be sure that we're not missing opportunities to find more innovative ways to interact with you as we continue to be virtual. So one of the questions that we asked in the survey related to the following. And what I'd love for you to do when you logged in tonight, there was an email that was sent to you, and I know we had it on screen. We asked folks to log on to either a web browser on your computer, or you can do this on your smartphone or your tablet. It'll work just as easily. but it's that pollev.com/AMP812. And it's probably going to ask you for your name. You can skip that if that's something that you prefer to offer, that's fine, but we're not asking for it this evening. This is just more of a test. But right now, essentially what we've done is we've created a portal that allows you all to weigh in on a question. And so we should be open for polling at this moment. And we're going to run through 3 of these. And the first question, all 3 of these come from the survey. I support investment in walking, biking, and transit options, right? And I cover up because you essentially get to choose 2 of these. Now, you may be a big fan of all of them, but I want you to think about the 2 that most resonate with you. Residents depend on affordable and equitable mobility choices. It encourages economic development. It supports environmental stewardship. It promotes personal and public health and safety. Just widening roads isn't a good way to manage growth. More people on foot, bike, and buses means fewer cars. And I don't support increasing investment in walk, bike, or transit. And so this is the moment where the technical team is crossing their fingers. We've got anxiety. Is the technology working for us? And with any luck, we should begin to see some results. All right. And so you can see how this is going to work. So in real time, as you all are voting, we'll start to see responses. And after a moment or 2, it tends to log all of your answers fairly quickly. You don't have to worry about making a mistake. It's only going to record the last vote that you might generate last. And so it's kind of foolproof from that perspective. But let's just take a look at these quick results and see how we compare. It looks like about 34% of you selected the first one, which was residents depend on affordable and equitable mobility choices, and owning a car, quite frankly, is expensive. And the second most frequently voted item was it supports environmental stewardship and air quality. Still a lot of movement there, but generally speaking, those are the spikes we're seeing. So this is telling me you found the buttons and we're receiving your votes, and that's a good thing. Let's go ahead and take a look at our next question in the interest of time. So we're going to do this the same way, and it'll take just a moment to refresh your screen, but in a moment, you should have a new question on your tablet or your screen that essentially says our primary streets, think of those as our larger order streets, our bigger streets, should be redesigned to be safer for all users and promote walking, biking, and riding transit. And we're simply asking, how much do you agree with that statement? 1 would suggest that you strongly disagree, and 5 is, I strongly agree, and you can vote anywhere in between. So let's take a moment and see how the task force feels about that statement. And at some point, what we'll be doing is, and within the next couple of weeks, we'll close the public survey and we'll generate a summary report for you so you don't have to read all the data in its raw format. We'll distribute that to you in advance. So there may be some discussion about it. There might be something we learned through that process. I would think that we'll probably find something incredibly insightful. But I'm not seeing a whole lot of folks disagreeing with the statement. In fact, it looks like we all tend to agree in some way, shape, or form that this is a good idea. But you know, sometimes those kinds of questions are kind of easy to lend your support to, and you have to ask a bit harder question to see how we really feel about it. And so I'm going to ask a follow-up to that, which essentially is, would you be willing to accept a modest increase in travel delay? In other words, it's going to take a little bit more time in order to make Charlotte's streets safer for all users. I think what you'll find is that everything we do in transportation has got a trade-off associated with it. So the idea of building something that's perfect is really outside of our grasp, but we have to aspire to something that's better, and we get to decide what is better.
So, Stephen, if you don't mind me asking, this is David Ward. How do we define primary streets?
Yeah, and we intentionally left that vague. If we were doing a scientific kind of poll for this, the way we authored it in the survey was we talked about our arterials, right? The larger order of streets. Kind of, I think one easy way to say this would be our busiest of streets and our multi-lane streets.
Okay.
And so, I mean, there's diversity even amongst this group. You know, these are tough choices, and we wouldn't expect that there would be uniform answers in any of the questions that we ask. I think what you're proving to us, though, tonight is that this technology is something that may work well for us, especially when we need to see what the task force is thinking as a collective. And so with your permission, we're probably going to continue to investigate ways with which we might leverage this in future meetings. But with that, that's pretty much all I had for you tonight. I want to thank you for your time. Mayor?
Thank you, Stephen. Very interesting. Did you share anything about how the sentiment of the task force aligns with the preliminary results of the survey that
I can take that.
I'm glad you asked.
So we've got a couple of questions from the public survey now. We can share those results, and I was taking notes on the task force responses just to be able to compare as we go through these. So next slide. So this was the first question that we just asked you all. Support investment in walking, biking, and transit options because your top three answers were the equity answer, residents depend on affordable and equitable mobility choices. That is the top answer we've been getting from the community as well. Your second answer, supports environmental stewardship and air quality, aligns with the second answer. And your third answer, growth management, aligns with the third most common answer. So y'all are in perfect alignment so far with what we've heard on the public survey. Next slide.
Excuse me, this is David again. Are the questions asked in the same order, or the options asked in the same order each time the poll is presented to somebody? For instance, if I saw the poll and then Ken saw the poll or Bill saw the poll, were those options in the exact same order for all three of us?
Yes, unless anyone knows otherwise. If you're taking the survey, anytime someone takes it, the responses and the questions are exactly the same and in the same order.
Okay. From a polling perspective, I may propose that if it's an option to alter the order, that there may be an impact there. Just a thought.
Thanks for that feedback. Let's go to the next slide. Oh, I'm sorry, Sarah, you were already on the next slide. This was the next question that we all asked you. Do we think that some of our larger streets should be redesigned to be safer for all users and promote walking, biking, and riding transit? The community at large, about 90% of respondents either agree or strongly agree. I think we had 100% agreement on the task force. So generally seem to be in alignment there as well. Next slide. And then this was the slightly harder question, which is, do you still agree, even if you would have to accept a modest increase in travel time in order to make our streets safer for all users? You all were remarkably close to this as well. I believe your answers were 84% yes, 16% no, as compared to 82% yes, 18% no from the community. So I think the good news is that at least on these three questions, which admittedly is a small sample size, we're seeing some pretty close alignment between you all as a task force and the early results that we are getting right now from the community.
Okay. Thanks, Scott. Any comments from the task force? So nothing has surprised you so far with regard to the survey results. It is fascinating that the community, these are relatively easy ones though, that the community feels pretty much like the task force does. We've now come to the public comment portion of our meeting, and let me just read you some of what we got. Can't read all of them, but one comment that came in was, To be a truly urban city, we must invest in transportation that suits individuals of all socioeconomic backgrounds. And that seems to be in alignment. I'm sure this listener must have gotten the message that the task force seems to feel that way also. From YouTube, a couple of voters, citizens said, bicycles are a priority. And another comment said, Eric is correct. The best cities are Vancouver, but we also ought to include Washington, D.C., Seattle, New York City, and to a lesser extent, Portland. Now, am I reading that correctly? Best cities, Vancouver, also Washington, Seattle, New York City, and to a lesser extent, Portland. See Christoph Spieler's recent book, Trains, Buses, and People. Most other cities like San Francisco, Dallas, and many cities, others, have had huge multimodal investments, but have not done a good job building the connectivity. Interesting point. And all of this is coming from somebody I think we all know, Martin Zimmerman. And can the state of mobility document, this document, be made available on the Charlotte Moves homepage as a PDF? Can we do that?
We will after October 13th, after the group has had the opportunity.
After October 13th?
Yes.
Yes, Martin, it will be made available after October 13th. Okay. Was that all that we had from the public?
Yeah, that's all right.
Okay. All right. Ty, can you tell us something about homework number 3 and
Okay.
the schedule?
Thank you. Once again, thank you very much. I was paying attention to both YouTube and Facebook, and you had almost 60 people listening into your conversations this evening. So that's
good.
That's almost consistent with what you had last time as well. So I think that's very helpful. Thank you very much. After Stephen made the presentation on the state of mobility, I deliberately held back sending this to you earlier today because I did not want to load you with so many documents or confuse anyone. So, but after I made this presentation and framed the content, I emailed that to all of you. It's a 42-page document, very easy to read. I got it earlier this afternoon. I was able to go through it, perhaps because I'm familiar with some of the numbers, but very fascinating, and it's likely to generate a lot of conversations. So we're not going to ask you to be in any group this time. We're just going to ask you to individually read. Now, that does not mean you cannot reach out to somebody else. Please feel free to reach out to another member of the task force and put heads together if you want to, or even call us and ask questions. But feel free to yellow mark, highlight, and make key points that you will bring up for discussions on October 13th. You don't need to send anything ahead of time. Just pretty much just read this on your own and provide information. The second, and kind of just share information with us on October 13th. The second part of the homework is the Charlotte Moves public survey. As Scott said earlier, we've got almost 1,000 respondents so far. Would like you to share this with your network. Every one of you belongs to a group, whether your fellow employees or others in your neighborhoods. If you're in a homeowners association group or community group, please feel free to share that survey link with your network. We want to get as many responses as possible to this survey. So those are the two pieces of your homework, and this is really on your own. And so we know that you're really committed to this. So we look forward to asking questions and listening to deliberations on October 13th. I think there's a next slide also that I'd like to pay attention to before I hand off to Mayor Gant. One of the things that we were discussing earlier, and there was a lot of conversation around 2021 or move it further, but down the line, somewhere in October or November, we'll be sharing with you some polling data that we are also doing to gauge community interest. And so, just reserve your questions for that time, but we will definitely be sharing some information with you because we're also asking folks regionally about 2021 and all of that. So we'll have more information to share with you in terms of what the public sentiment is about that. But part of the process going forward is when we meet with you on October 13th, we'll be talking about mode shift. Once again, technical term like Stephen said, but we will be talking about that. We'll share the map of a transformational mobility network, what that looks like. October 13th is that additional date. And then October 22nd, we'll come back with in terms of cost as well. So again, this is very informational, and this information will be available on the Charlotte Moves website. Thank you.
Thank you, Ty. And again, I want to say thank you to the task force. I think we covered a lot of ground tonight, and I have a sense that that you're recognizing more and more the degree of analysis we need to get into, both from the standpoint of what a transformational mobility network is all about, and the more important, equally important issue of how we're going to fund it. And those additional meetings that have been placed on the calendar are much needed, and I hope you feel the same way. So October 13th, we look to see you again. And I'm just impressed with the level of participation and attendance by all of you in these virtual settings. I've been pushing the city and pushing Ty particularly to say, look, I really would like to see some of these folks face to face. Can we not find a room where we are socially distanced, masked, and get the opportunity at least to rub elbows? I just think the dialogue would even be better. But under the circumstances, I think we've done as well as we possibly could do with 24 people and a city staff and consultants making this work so far. And perhaps as the environment gets a little better, we may find a room where we can accomplish what I so badly desire. I was saying the other day, is it possible to end up doing all of the work of this task force and not get to see a single one of you in person? And I didn't ask Mandy Cohen or any of the other folks, but it may be that we may be virtual the entire time through December, but let's keep hoping for a better time. Thank you, and I hope we've been reasonably respectful of your time. And thank you again. See you on the 13th of October. Good night.